So, what did we talk about last week? Or should I say, who did we talk about last week? No? A human. Yes, I did say Cain and Abel because that is who we talked about last week. What is the story of Cain and Abel? Morning. What? Yes, you will be kicked. So heads up there. Tell me the story of Cain and Abel. What did we learn last week? Cain killed his brother. Here's an artist reenactment of what that may have looked like. If you look closely in this still frame photo, you can clearly see the AK-47 assault rifle that Cain used to shoot Abel, which is, of course, why we do not allow people to own AK-47s. They're just bad things. Remember, people don't kill people, guns kill people. So, there's that. Before we move on, so we know Cain killed Abel, but what made Cain want to kill Abel? Jealousy. Okay, very good. You misspoke. Yeah, you said the right thing. You just put the names in the wrong spot, but that's okay. That's just misspeaking. God looked with favor on Abel's offering, but with no regard for Cain's offering. Why didn't God care for Cain's offering? What did we surmise? Correct. They weren't coming for atonement. So did it matter? Let me go back to this photo. Did it matter if they brought, hello Reagan, did it matter if they brought flesh or fruit? Yes or no? Yes. No, it didn't matter because they weren't coming to atone for sin or pay the cost of sin and pay a blood price. The text clearly says 3 times they were bringing offerings. Offerings are different than sacrifices. Sacrifices have to be a blood price under the law. They're not living under the law, but the language is there deliberately for the readers under the Mosaic law. An offering is a free gift you bring because you want to spend some time with God, you want to share a meal with God. And when that's all you're doing, it can be flesh or it can be fruit. So their offerings were perfectly fine to be either one. So what was the problem with Cain's offering? Or did I just mess up asking the question? Okay, so let me ask it a different way. Was there a problem with Cain's offering itself? No. What was the problem? Okay, good. I like that. It wasn't from the bottom of his heart. He didn't really care about God. He wasn't acting in faith. He was acting, and you see this as he acts it out, he was acting mechanically. He expected the results to be there automatically. They weren't, so he gets jealous and he slays his brother. Ha 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 ha. Okay, morning, Casey. You are on children's church duty this morning, officially, okay? You can see I put the thing up on the wall just in case at any point. Okay, good. We got just about everybody here. So, is Nick here? I'm sorry, Nick. Is Zane here?
I did not. I'm
not Okay, so he was paying attention last week. Caught that. But what's the problem with that? Cain was responsible. Look, we saw the same things playing out in Genesis 4 that we did in Genesis 3. God comes to Cain and he says, "Where's your brother Abel?" Just as God came to Adam and said, "Where are you?" He's trying to act out, calling Cain to repentance. Cain went far further than Adam and Eve. Instead of just deflecting and trying to paint himself in the best of lights about his actions, he just shrugs it off and says, "I don't know, am I my brother's keeper?" And the implied answer to that is yes, you are your brother's keeper, because God made us to serve and to guard other people. Cain is the firstborn son. He is responsible for the little ones born to Adam and Eve after him, to a certain degree. And so God pretty much says, yes, you are responsible. Cain doesn't repent in any way, shape, and form. God calls him on his sin, says, you will be judged. The land will no longer produce anything for you because Cain is a farmer, Abel is a shepherd. That's why they brought fruit, Cain brought fruit and Abel brought flesh. And then he marks him and says, you will be sent off and no longer under the protection of your family. That Cain complains about it. But remember, I argued that Cain in no way, shape, or form confessed or regretted his actions at all. I don't think there's anything in the text that actually makes Cain a good guy. I think he is the epitome of a dark lord. He never learns his lesson. It's never a problem with him. It's always a problem with other people. That's how he viewed the sacrifices. It's an external thing. It's not me, it's the sacrifice. God should have accepted my sacrifice, offering, because I brought it. And God says, no, I look deeper than just the mechanics. I look deeper than just the physical. I'm looking at your heart, and I find that when you kill your brother, your heart is not right. So God didn't accept his offering. So Cain is now exiled in judgment and all the other stuff that played out in Genesis 3, played out in Genesis 4 to an even higher degree. So let's watch this quick video. This will take about, 2 minutes? This will review a little bit last week and introduce a bit of a motif that we're going to talk about this week. Genesis 4, we're going to start in verse 17 while this plays.
Near the beginning of the story of the Bible, a man named Cain becomes jealous of his brother, who's getting God's favor.
And God tells Cain, be careful with your anger because sin is a monster that wants to consume you, but you can rule it.
Cain gives in to the monster and murders his brother.
And as a result, God sends Cain into the wilderness, and there he builds the first city in the story of the Bible.
One man builds an entire city?
Well, in the ancient world, a city was a group of homes surrounded by a wall. It's for protection. Cain's afraid that someone might find him and kill him.
Okay, got it. The wall makes the city.
Exactly. And then the city of Cain goes on to breed a culture of revenge and violence. Later, one of the city's warriors, who's like a corrupt king, boasts in a song, if you threaten or slap me or wound my honor, I'll kill you. This is the mindset at work in Cain's city.
The monster that Cain let within has now become the monster that people live within. The city is bad news.
But it doesn't have to be. The city of Cain is also where music is invented, along with metalworking and animal domestication.
So cities can be a place where we create abundance for everyone, but give the city enough time and that monster will eventually take over.
Right. Like the next city, founded by a giant warrior king who builds a city with a tower that reaches up into the heavens to make their name great.
This is Babylon, which will one day spread its violence throughout the land, conquering many nations.
Yes, Babylon is the biblical image of a monstrous, violent human city. And this is all tragic because the city is the opposite of the safe garden home that God originally put humans in.
So ancient cities have imposing walls for self-protection to keep resources inside.
But the garden is protected by God, with a spring at its center that flows out into rivers that share its goodness with all the land.
Babylon has a tower at its center to reach up to the heavens.
While the garden has the tree of life at its center, God's heavenly throne and presence touching down on the land.
The mindset of the city is self-preservation and peace enforced by the threat of death.
But the culture of the garden is peace through generosity, because there's always enough to go around.
Let's go back to the garden.
Yes, you would think so. But the surprise of the biblical story is that God plans to bring his garden to the city.
Okay. The Bible Project does a great job putting that stuff in visual format. And what you can see starting in Genesis 4, and we're about to read the first part of the text, is that Genesis starts a motif between the city and the garden. God planted a garden. Now, I think the garden definitely had walls because it has a gate that can be guarded. Gardens in the ancient world had walls, but they were very different from a city where you locked yourself in, closed the gates at night and stuff. But we'll talk more about this. There's a beginning motif, and it's going to carry on from chapter 4 down to chapter 11 with Babel, the city of Babel. And Babel or Babylon will become the great enemy of God's people in the Old Testament, all the way through Revelation, where Babylon is the city of evil and corruption. And then God brings his own new city, the new Jerusalem, down to conquer Babylon. So there's a beginning of a motif here that we're going to follow. But first, let's read the end of Genesis 4. There's a bunch of names in here, so I'm going to read it rather than having everybody else read this turn by turn, slide by slide. Starting in verse 17, Cain made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad. To Irad was born Mahujael, and Mahujael was the father of Methushael. Methushael was the father of Lamech. Lamech married two women, one named Ada, the other Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who lived in tents and raised livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who play stringed instruments and pipes. Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. So, let's talk about Cain's line that we're given here east of Eden and this motif of the city a little bit. Talk about why this is included in the story. So Cain builds a city. He calls it Enoch after his son. This is the first city mentioned in the Bible, and of course it begins a negative motif throughout the Bible generally. You will see, especially in Genesis, that where God is living and dwelling with humans, or where his presence is with people, is typically going to be outside the city, and the places that are urbanized and industrialized are going to be the places with the most corruption and where God goes to judge them. The two obvious city areas in Genesis, other than Babel, or Enoch here, are Sodom and Gomorrah. You see, Abraham at that time is going to be living in fields and tents and stuff away from the city. Sodom and Gomorrah is the city place, and he sends angels down to test the city. It's very corrupt, so he destroys the city. So you see a negative motif is starting to form. And this genealogy and these words of Lamech are going to tell us why. Remember, being east of Eden is a negative idea. It's a phrase of saying you're away from God. Cain went out from the presence of God in 4:15, 16, somewhere right there at the end. He's exiled. And we said that's meaning he's deliberately leaving God's path and going after his own way. And he builds a city in the very next verse. So this tells us, it links us to a negative character in a negative place. And we see, as the city plays out through Cain's line, why it comes to be so negative. This is what I already said, sorry. They just don't attract the godliest of people. They mostly attract the kind of people like Cain and his descendants. So we've already talked about Cain. Let's talk a little bit about his descendants from this biblical genealogy. Never skip a genealogy. If I find out you've been skipping genealogies, I will fight you. Okay? That's no lie. All right? Genealogies, they tell you important things about the story that the author wants you to know. And if you can understand the pattern of genealogies, and then you look for them to break the pattern, you will find that's the important part of the genealogy. Do they add something or do they take something away from the normal setup? Why is the genealogy there? Are they covering every person in the bloodline? Probably not. Very rarely do you cover every single person born in the genealogy. You add and you subtract as you need to. For instance, in Matthew chapter 1, Matthew has 3 portions of his genealogy from Abraham to Jesus with 14 people in each of the 3 sections. That doesn't mean that there was exactly 14 people. He's only counting by 14s, and he has a purpose for doing that that we won't go into. But not every person that's born has to be in the genealogy. They're allowed to condense it down. But where they usually end up is usually going to be the point. So they will condense it down to get to the last person in line to make their point. And typically it's that last person in line that tells you everything you need to know about why the genealogy is included. These are general rules for genealogies that help you read narratives in the Old Testament in particular. So this is Cain's genealogy. You have Adam and Eve, and you have Cain, and then you get mentioned Enoch, Irad, Mahujael, Methuselah, and Lamech. So adding Adam and Cain to this, Lamech is the seventh counted from Adam. Sometimes you want to count the numbers. Numbers were important in the ancient world, and 7 is an important number. 7 is the number of completion or perfection in the ancient world, at least to the Hebrews. So, down to Lamech is 7. Lamech is the seventh from Adam. So maybe we want to ask ourselves, what kind of man is Lamech? And verses 19 through 24 cover his family and give us some words that he himself spoke to tell us what kind of man he is. Lamech is a man of power, polygamy, and poetry. Lamech is cruel, arrogant, rules by fear, intimidation, and domination. How do you know? Verse 19, 1 is the first mention of a man with multiple wives. This is the first mention of polygamy in the Bible. Genesis is a book that means beginnings and has a lot of firsts in it. The first city is being built, and in the first city, we find the first man who essentially kind of collects wives. That's the idea of becoming a rich and powerful king in the ancient world. One way that you ascribe your growing power was to sleep with a bunch of women. And so Lamech is described as the first person to have 2 wives. So his character is already suspicious for doing such a thing in the story. You're supposed to look on him and saying, ooh, a descendant of Cain who's the first person to take more than one woman. That puts him in a negative light. Then he actually talks, and his poetic statement, verses 23 and 24, spoken to his wives, tells us everything we need to know about his mindset. And here's what he says. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. So, what does all of this mean? I'm just going to give you the general sense here that Lamech is boasting of saying, when it says wounding me or injuring me, that could mean somebody actually attacked him, but it could also mean that somebody just insulted him. It doesn't have to be a physical attack. It could just be an attack with words. And he killed a man and is boasting about it for nothing more than being insulted. That's the type of man Lamech is. In fact, he's so boastful about it that he says, if Cain is avenged 7 times, going back to God's protection of him, he says, I'm avenged 77 times. You think you're going to attack me? You think you're going to kill me? Bring it on. He's boasting about it and challenging people to come after him. This is the type of person that Lamech is. And we get this condensed and shoved in to a couple of verses because that's how good storytelling and poetry works. And he's saying this to his wives. And so the idea is he's boasting to create fear and intimidation in his wives so they will not challenge him. But through his wives publicly announcing it and saying, if anybody thinks that they can beat me and take my spot, let them try. Because I killed a man just for insulting me. I'll kill every last one of you if you stand in my way. That's the point of the point. And when he says, I have killed a man, a young man, this word yelled here, probably means a small, young, maybe a teenage boy. And so you see that he's a big bully who picks on people younger than him, probably. This is why I challenged you to a fight earlier, Grant, okay? Because I know I can beat you. Because it's not a very big man who goes around, picks a fight with people smaller than him that he knows he can beat. So you see, I was already having this illustration in my mind earlier, right? You get this idea from the language, and sometimes it's just a simple word designed to fit with a couple of words around it that tell you everything you need to know. This is not a good guy. And just as an aside, if you compare this to Matthew 18, starting in verse 21 and going to the end of the parable that Jesus says in light of this, this is where Peter comes to Jesus and he says, Master, how many times should I forgive my enemies? Up to 7 times? And Jesus says, I tell you not 7, 77 times. And then he tells a parable about forgiveness here. And he deliberately takes Lamech's attitude and turns it on its head, because Peter thinks that he's being really, really forgiving here, because the rabbis of his time would say, oh, you can forgive somebody up to 3 times. And after the 3rd time, if they do it a 4th, just cut them off from your life. And so Peter's saying, more than twice as much I'm willing to forgive. What do you think about that, Jesus? And Jesus says, you should be willing to forgive over and over and over again the person who's willing to ask for forgiveness. Then he tells the parable to reinforce this. And it's directly related to flip Lamech's idea up on its head. He's willing to not to forgive, but to kill and slay a man just for wounding him, which may mean nothing more than insulting him. So this is all what I've said here. Lamech boasts of killing a man just for insulting him, challenges anybody else to try. Cain's line is devolving into a wretched form of living. That's the point of this inclusion, ending in Lamech. Despite the growing technologies and economic advances of this urban outlet and all that they bring, which we'll talk about in just a moment, their moral fiber is decaying. Humanity's corruption is seen as spreading and deepening really, really badly. Between polygamy, murder, and boasting about it, God's intention for humanity to serve and to guard, to be my brother's keeper, is being twisted. And instead, serving others becomes dominating them with your power, using them to keep your women in line, and threatening men to come and attack you or shut up and get in line. That's Lamech's point. Guarding others becomes using power to threaten them. Listen, you don't have to do what I say, but I really want the best for you, so it would be good for you if you actually followed where I'm trying to lead you. It's a very different attitude of letting somebody have the freedom to tell you no than to saying, you're not free, you can't tell me no, you will do what I say or I will destroy you. All of this is shown by Cain's family line expanding and following his example down 7 generations. The question is it all bad all the time? And the answer is no. It's not all bad. There's a hint of light in this dark place. Because you have Lamech's sons via Ada, Jabal, who's the father of all who live in tents and raise livestock. And then you have Jubal, who's the father of all who make and play instruments and string pipes. So here you see technology and culture growing. And Lamech's son via Zillah is Tubal-Cain, who's the father of smithing, forging tools, and iron and bronze, which may mean weapons, but the fact that weapons aren't mentioned may mean we're not supposed to think of it necessarily as a negative. Technology and culture is advancing and growing, and that's a good thing. The multiplication of people in the city leads to development of culture and technology, but also corruption and violence for men like Lamech. So God is accepting both, the corruption and the evil alongside of the good. The culture and the technology is good, but men like Cain and Lamech, through them, they are becoming twisted in their use. Your phone is not an evil thing. What it connects you to is not a bad thing. But when you have a culture of saying all that matters is having the latest technology and keeping up with the Kardashians and always being on the front lines of what's new and available and stuff, your attitude is twisting and you're going after the wrong thing. And you turn around and you attack people who have better technology than you and try and take their technological advances and stuff. This is the world that's developing right now. And this is important because when we're done with chapter 5 today, next week we get into chapter 6 and the corruption of the world, and the second rebellion that we'll talk about leads to God saying, you have 120 years left and then I'm wiping you out. We're getting to that in the story. And this is the seeds of Cain starting to sprout and grow in the world. The question is there any hope for the world? What has become of God's promise to send a seed? Adam made love to his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in the place of Abel, since Cain killed him. Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to call upon the name of Yahweh. So right in the middle of all this corruption and all this arrogance and all this attitude of Cain's line developing, we get a new line. And we need to ask ourselves, is Seth the seed that was promised by God in 3:15, Genesis 3:15? God has granted me another child in place of Abel since Cain killed him. This is the NIV's translation. Now, the Hebrew word that gets translated child here is the same exact word for seed as Genesis 3:15. The word is zerah in Hebrew. Okay? He's making a linguistic connection, and it gets obscured when you translate it simply as child. But the author wants us now to track the bloodline of Adam and Eve through this seed. Thus, chapter 5 gives us the line of Seth's descendants. And that's what chapter 5 is there to do. It's going to compare Seth's descendants in the line of this seed with Cain's descendants in this line of corruption, both growing at the same time, and we're going to see what we can get when we can compare their attitudes. We'll do that in just a moment. But first, I want you to see a couple of other things about this statement. At this time, humanity begins to call upon the name of Yahweh. Calling or proclaiming the name of Yahweh was to declare him to be the God and King of creation. There's an attitude here that says we're no longer going to rebel against God outside of the garden. Seth appears to be a good father who is teaching the good lessons to his son in contrast to Cain. Seth and his line will be portrayed as a positive influence on the world in contrast to Cain. The whole thing is meant to contrast. Any questions on that thus far? Now, if you go back and you can compare verse 25, God has granted me another child in the place of Abel. That God has granted me is a very different statement than what Eve says in chapter 4, verse, I think it's just 1. I have acquired a child, Yahweh, where she seems to be boasting and saying, possibly saying, I've produced the seed, Yahweh. Aha, I did it. She seems to be boasting a little bit about what she's done. And if you could compare that to verse 25, where she's very humble and she acknowledges, God gave me this child, her words are pointed in a positive light. And so her statement in verse 1 sets up the negative light of the child Cain and what his story goes through. And here the positive statement in Hebrew sets up the positive light that the child is actually going through. If you're a close reader of the biblical story, if you slow down and you pay attention, and maybe you do a little bit of reading and research about what these statements are actually trying to say in their original intention, you can pick up on this. This is not an impossible task, even for you at your age. I started doing this when I was 13. All right, so now we're going to get Seth's line. This is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them. And he named them mankind when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. We'll talk about just those 3 verses here in just a minute, because that is fundamentally important to how that gets worded in this language. But moving on for the moment. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years and then he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. After he became the father of Enosh, Seth had lived 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Seth lived a total of 912 years and then he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he became the father of Kenan. After he became the father of Kenan, Enosh lived 815 years and he had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enosh lived a total of 905 years and then he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he became the father of Mahalalel. After he became the father of Mahalalel, Kenan lived 840 years and he had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Kenan lived a total of 910 years, and then he died. When Mahalalel has lived 65 years, he became the father of Jared. That's a dumb name. Yeah, I said it. Jared. After he became the father of Jared, dumb name, Mahalalel lived 830 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Mahalalel lived a total of 895 years, and then he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he became the father of Enoch. After he became the father of Enoch, Jared lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. After Jared had lived a total of 962 years, then he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more because God took him. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became the father of Lamech, different Lamech. After he became the father of Lamech, Methuselah lived 782 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Methuselah lived a total of 969 years. Then he died. Methuselah is the oldest living person recorded in the Bible. 1 second, Grant. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he had a son. He named him Noah and said, "He will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed." When Noah was born, Lamech lived 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Lamech lived a total of 777 years, and then he died. After Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But let's ask just kind of an obvious question and get this out of the way first. What's up with the long lives? Is it literal or is it literary? Oh, it's only in Genesis 5 here with Seth's line and in chapter 11, 10 through 26, with his descendants after the flood getting to Abraham, that such lifespans are even mentioned. So there's only 2 places in the entire Bible with long lifespans, and they're both the line of the seed. Interesting. Is it somehow tied to the Sumerian sexagesimal system of kings? You think these lines are long? Wait until you read the Sumerian line of kings. The antediluvian, which means pre-flood kings of the Sumerian kings list. You see 8 kings here, each of them living and ruling for no less than 18,600 years, and the longest ruling for 43,200 years. 8 kings that are said to compile 241,200 years between all of their rules. You think these lifespans are long? You have no idea what the ancient world actually believed. The answer is, I don't know if these are literal or if these are literary. I will say that there could be a literary point to all of this. I didn't put this stuff on a slide, so let me just back up. If there's a literary point, these numbers here are designed to say, hey, look at our kings. We're so good, we're so godly, we have access to the gods, and our kings live a long time. Therefore, our reigns are legitimate. The author of in the ancient world, writing Genesis 1 through 11, this prologue to Genesis, could know exactly what these things are and try to take them and say, well, actually, the legitimate line of kings or the line of God's blessed seed is this line, and so these people live this long. And he takes their mathematics, shortens it down for a reason, because if you actually take the sexagesimal lesson and you take these and you put the decimal in a different spot, the way the Hebrews actually do the numbering, instead of multiplying it by 6 as a sexagesimal, then by 10, if you just put the decimal in where the Hebrews did it by 10, you come to very similar math, but much shorter time frame. And so it's entirely possible that the author is trying to make a literary point by doing his own math, giving these lifespans this length, and saying God legitimized this length of life for these people because this was the blessed line. These kings, if you follow the table of nations, would have been said to descend from this horrible line of Cain down through. We'll get into that later. Not Cain, Ham through Canaan later on. But anyways, it is possible that the author is making a literary point because he understood a tool that the ancient world used to glorify their kings, adapted it for his own purposes, and used it in two places, Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, to legitimize the line of the seed through Seth. It could be that. But because we cannot know for certain that that's what they're doing, I'm going to stick with these are probably supposed to be taken as literal numbers. But it could just be a literary device. Okay, moving on because we don't have a lot of time here. The written account or generations of Adam. 5:1, the Hebrew word used here, marks family histories in Genesis 10 times. The Hebrew word is toledot. It either gets translated written account, the generations, but you see 5:1, 6:9, 10:1, 11:10, 11:27, 25:12, 25:19, 36:1, 36:9, and 37:2. It tracks 10 family lines in 10 genealogical accounts in the book of Genesis. 10 is an important number. There are 10 names in Seth's account from Adam down to Noah. Noah is the 10th in line. 7 is an important number, but so is 10. Note, Cain's line in chapter 4 is not labeled as one of these 10. He did not label it as a written account or a generation. He wants you to compare these legitimate families with Cain's illegitimate family, and he's making a literary point by not including it. So what we said was you're supposed to compare Seth's line with Cain's line. Cain goes 7 generations down to Lamech. Seth's line goes 10 down. So the 10th person is Noah, but who is the 7th person in Seth's line? Oh, I forgot about this. Let me hit this real quick. This language, when God created mankind and he made them in the likeness of God and he blessed them, this repeating in the first 2 verses here. And then Adam has a son in his own likeness. This is tying together the narratives to say God is the father of all. And God is continuing on in the rebellion and the corruption of Cain's line. He is still continuing on being a father to the people. John Sailhammer, who's dead now, but he was a good Old Testament theologian, summarized it like this in the Expositor's Bible commentary on Genesis that he wrote. He said, the role of God as Father is heightened by the parallels between the creation of Adam in the image of God and Adam's fathering a son in his own likeness, in his own image, in verse 3. Such details show that the author has gone to great lengths to cast God's creation of Adam in terms of recalling an ancient patriarch's establishment and overseeing of his growing family. By casting God as the father to Adam, suggests that God is the father of them all. Without calling God the father of Adam, he paints the picture that Adam is God's son, God is his father, and that means that all who follow in Adam's line are God's children. Some of them are in rebellion like Cain, but some of them are still blessed the way God blessed humanity to be. This last sentence here, if we continue to trace the lines of genealogical list throughout Genesis, a central point emerges. God is the creator and father of all humanity. Look at chapter 10 with the table of nations. So the point of the inclusion of the genealogies and the wording here in the beginning of chapter 5 in the first 3 verses is to remind us that it's not just humans having children. It is God blessing them because God is a good father and he wants to continue to have relationships with his children. That is not a small thing. Fatherly blessings of God and the renewal of God's promises to the next generation can be tracked all throughout Genesis. Divine blessing is still possible in spite of rebellion. And the example right here in chapter 5 is Enoch in verse 24. Because Enoch is the 7th from Adam via Seth, where Lamech is the 7th from Adam via Cain. There's a comparison here. Number 7. Enoch is the seed of Seth and those who walk with God in Seth's line. The 7th from Adam via Seth is the antithesis, contrasted, the exact opposite of Lamech. Lamech was cruel, cowardly, and a fool. Enoch walks faithfully with God, and then God blesses him so much he never had to die. He takes him away without tasting death. They could not be more distinct. And you will not pick up on that picture if you skip the genealogies. You will not get the flavor of Seth's line as a godly line and Cain's line as an ungodly line if you don't pay attention to what's going on here. So the seventh son of Adam is the antithesis of Lamech in every way. What is the point of the contrast? Life is not found in living selfishly, seeking power and seeking to dominate people by fear, the way that Lamech lives. Life is found in walking with God. Thus, Lamech lived and never died. This sets the stage for every biblical doctrine to come. All of this upside down expectation that you gain life by doing the opposite of gaining riches and glory and power and sex. God flips it on its head right here and says, the person that I chose to live forever wasn't Lamech, who collected wives and threatened people. It was Enoch, who very little is known about, but the only thing that matters is known. He walked faithfully with God. Service and guardianship, not domination and control. Love, not fear. That is the point here. Sorry, we're not going to have time to watch that because we're out of time here. I want to give you time before the service starts. So you see, all of this is being compared here. And a last few things to note on genealogies. Genealogies have this pattern of moving from one person, expanding out and giving you a bunch of people, and then narrowing the focus in again. So humanity is expanding from Adam, and it's giving you two lines. And it's going to narrow in on the line of Seth via Noah. And then after the flood, Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, are going to expand out again. And then the book of Genesis is going to narrow its focus again on Abraham. And then Abraham's family throughout the book of Genesis is going to expand, and then you're going to narrow the focus again. And the Old Testament is going to do this over and over again, and genealogies are a tool that they use to narrow their focus all the way until the New Testament, where you get the line of Israel and the line of Judah and the line of kings narrowed over and over and over again down to one man, Jesus of Nazareth. And if you're skipping genealogies because you find them boring, you're going to miss the theological point in Matthew 1:1, right when you get to the beginning of the New Testament and a genealogy of Jesus. In every other genealogical phrase in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, you will not find the phrase, and then he died, included ever. Why is it included in chapter 5? Because one of its members didn't die. So where they can imply it in every other place, he has to explicitly make the point, and then this guy died, and then this guy died, and then this guy didn't die. He walked with God faithfully, and God took him. He was no more. So he didn't die. But then his son died, and then his son died, and then his son, he has to make that literary point. And out of saying that, it makes the point that real life is found in God. It is not found in collecting women as trophies or in sexual conquest. It is not found in power and riches or growing culture and authority. It is not found in creating new technologies. It is found walking faithfully with God. And it is up to you to decide whether or not you're going to do that and find true life. Or if you're going to be like Cain and his descendants and go off on your own, do whatever you want to do, and ultimately die as a consequence, very far away from God.